Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special two-night edition of the Daily Drum. I'm Harold Fisher. Over the next 2 nights, a critical discussion on the COVID-19 vaccine, clinical trials, and why the African-American community needs to be front and center on this issue. We'll drill down on the vaccine process. Once it's approved, how to know it's safe and effective for you and your family. Now, we've assembled some of the best and brightest minds in the research and medical community. These Black experts have a seat at the clinical trial approval table and will take us beyond the rhetoric and politics to the scientific facts. Making it plain. Now, the town hall is brought to you in part by WHUR, the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, Howard University, the Morehouse School of Medicine, Meharry Medical College, Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, the National Medical Association, Cobb Institute, and the National Urban League. Now, tonight's special is being streamed on WHUR.com, YouTube, Facebook Live on WHUR, blackdoctor.org, and the National Urban League. It will be rebroadcast on our sister station, WHUT-TV, at a later date. Now, we will not be taking any calls tonight, but we invite you to post your questions and comments online using the hashtag #VaccineTownHall. And our experts will be addressing them throughout the program. Plus, we will have a special Q&A online at 8 p.m. So please stay around for that. I want to get into the discussion right now. And I would like to begin with Dr. Frederick. Dr. Frederick is the president of Howard University, and he is I'm honored to have him with us on this program. He's going to help us shape tonight's discussion. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Frederick, he is also a surgeon, and he serves as the distinguished Charles R. Drew Professor of Surgery at Howard University. Now, Dr. Frederick, as we know, it's often said that when America catches a cold, the Black community catches pneumonia. That statement has been especially true when it comes to African Americans and the COVID-19 pandemic. Share with us your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. This pandemic has been disproportionately impacting the African American community. African Americans are far more likely, when they do contract this virus, to end up dying from it. And that is a very, very grave circumstance. But it goes well beyond that. Social distancing, when you look at frontline workers, etc., it means that African Americans are also more at risk because of the inability to participate in all of those activities. Securing PPE as a frontline worker, being able to quarantine in their homes is not as readily available as well. So as a result, anything that is a potential cure or preventative measure for COVID-19 must be given to the Black community because of the vulnerability that we possess. Clinical trials are critical for health. And what we do with clinical trials is we test medications in a safe manner to ensure that everyone will be using a medication that is approved and has gone through the necessary rigor so that we can be assured that it is safe. That's a process that's very rigorous, and we know that there has been a history in the past of not doing that well. The historically Black medical schools that are participating over these next 2 nights have committed through a statement of research principles to ensure that we protect our community. So as a result, making it plain is extremely important. And we intend tonight and tomorrow to begin a process of not only providing you with information, but we will continue that into the very near future.
Dr. Frederick, thank you for that. I now want to go to Mark Morial, President and Chief Executive Officer with the National Urban League. Mr. Morial, thank you so much for joining us. We want to make sure that Mr. Morial has his microphone up, and certainly when we can get that squared away, we will go back to him. Dr. Frederick, I would like to return to you because I want to have Dr. Gary Gibbons join this conversation. He is the director at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at NIH. Dr. Gibbons, thank you so much for joining us. Explain the role of NIH and the Institute.
Well, the National Institutes of Health is the largest biomedical research agency in the world, with a budget of over $40 billion. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute that I direct is one of 27 institutes and centers. Our budget's $3.5 billion. And what we've learned about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 is this novel coronavirus is a respiratory virus. So it's spread through breathing in, and it attacks and enters the cells that line the lungs. It also enters the cells that are part of the heart, as well as the lining of the blood vessels. And so it affects the heart and lung and blood systems. And that's the mission of our institute, to turn discovery science into the health of the nation. And this COVID-19 is in effect attacking all those major organs. We also are committed to addressing health inequities. And as Dr. Frederick noted, that this has been disproportionately burdened in the communities of color. So it's the mission of NIH to understand this novel coronavirus, understand what it's doing to the body, and develop targeted therapies to not only treat it such that it's less lethal, and people can live a healthier course with this disease, as well as to ultimately prevent it by developing vaccines. So that's our mission, and that's why we're leaning in with a very aggressive effort in discovery science, clinical trials, and other efforts in community engagement to ensure that we know that drugs that are safe and effective and vaccines that are safe and effective are taken up by the communities most burdened, so that they can have the greatest benefit from these safe and effective treatments.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Frederick.
Dr. Gibbons, with that in mind, long before you joined the Institute at NIH, you were a distinguished researcher, and you have participated in these types of activities. For our viewers, can you walk them through the process of research around developing a vaccine, and what exactly is a vaccine?
Well, that's a great question. Many of the listeners, probably when they were children, were vaccinated with things to protect them from developing measles or rubella or polio and other infectious diseases. This is because vaccines are able to activate our body's defense system, our immune system, such that when there's a foreign invader of a bacteria, or in this case, a virus, that all the body's defenses are summoned to really go after that virus, attack it, kill it, and remove it from the body, and try to do as little damage to the body itself as possible. The immune system is incredibly made, and so it's constantly on surveillance, constantly on duty, looking for these foreign invaders. And in some sense, viruses are almost like burglars to your house. They come in as foreign agents, and they can only live if they break into the home, if you will, of a cell within your body. And so in this case, they break into the cells of your lungs or your blood vessels. And that's the only way they can reproduce and make more progeny, more offspring, and copy themselves. So one virus can get into a cell, break into that home cell, and produce thousands more viruses that then spreads from cell to cell throughout a tissue, such that it basically takes over your whole lung, and you have pneumonia, or you have these other disorders to the point where you can't breathe. And so the key thing is, how can we help the immune system form a defense? And this is a novel coronavirus. Nobody's seen one like this before. Nobody's body has seen something like this before. And that's why it's so devastating and lethal. So that's why we need vaccines that are able to take a part of the virus. In this case, it's almost like looking at a king. the crown of the virus along its sort of head are these little spikes. And that's actually the key that it uses to get into cell, like to burglarize the cell and get inside. Well, you can now take that protein, that coat, that crown, and expose it to an individual, and it will think, your immune system will think it's the whole virus, but it's only a piece of the virus, and it will marshal the entire immune system to fight it. And so that's what a vaccine is. It's providing that piece of the virus, not the whole virus, just a piece of it, such that the body will mount an immune response and attack it in a way that will help you ward off the virus. That's what we're trying to do with a vaccine and get as many people vaccinated as possible.
And for that, in order to get many people vaccinated, you obviously, as you take that piece of the virus to create that vaccine, you want to make sure, obviously, that doesn't have a bad side effect, and therefore there's a clinical trial. Maybe you can explain for our listeners what exactly is a clinical trial and what role does NIH and NHLBI play in ensuring that those types of trials are conducted in a way that protects the human subjects who may participate in the trial.
Okay. Well, the National Institutes of Health, both the NHLBI and in this case, National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, it's run by Dr. Tony Fauci, we're part of a whole network of clinical trials in which we have experts at conducting clinical trials. And in these trials, what we're able to do is to define whether an agent, like a vaccine, is both safe and effective. And we do that by a process of randomization, where it's like a coin flip. And for an individual, like a Dr. Frederick, will decide to give you a placebo, something that is inert, like salt water in an injection, versus the vaccine itself. And by comparing those who got the salt water versus the true vaccine, we can tell a couple of things. We will track them to be sure they don't have any adverse effects. So it's not unusual after you get a shot to have soreness of the arm. That may be common in both the salt water as well as the vaccine. But then, because you're in an environment like in this country where there's a lot of COVID, we then track those individuals. And if the virus, if the vaccine is effective, there'll be fewer cases of COVID in those who got the vaccine as compared to those who got the salt water. Moreover, one of the other things that we'll see and look for is as to whether there are any differences in adverse effects, bad things that happen that we didn't anticipate in either one of those arms, and particularly the vaccine arm. So we want to be sure that it's safe, there are not more adverse consequences, and also that there's benefit, that it protected individuals from getting COVID. And in doing so in a rigorous manner with lots of people, most of these trials in phase 3 are about 30,000 people, we can be sure that we have safety and efficacy. I might also add that these are monitored on a continuous basis by an independent review board, data safety monitoring board. These are experts at monitoring trials, and their job is to be sure that the participants are safe and that the study has integrity. And they don't respond to any outside voices. They just look at the data and call it in terms of whether the study showed no difference, or whether one arm had more adverse outcomes, or one arm had clearly more benefit. So those are all the elements of the trial.
I want to thank you.
I just want to thank you very much for joining us. I think that information was exactly what we needed, and we wish you continued success, and please stay safe and healthy.
Thank you
very much, Dr. Gibbons. We appreciate it. We now have Mark Morial, President and Chief Executive Officer with the National Urban League. Mr. Morial, thank you so much for joining this conversation. I know we were having some difficulty catching up with you earlier, but now that you are with us, please share your thoughts about this really critical issue.
So let me thank you, Harold, and let me thank the Howard University community, as well as the leaders of the 4 Black medical schools in the United States, along with the National Institutes of Health and all of the sponsors for doing this tonight. We know that there's been great distrust around medical research in our community. But we also know this: COVID is killing us. COVID is killing us. And the rate of death and the rate of infection is alarming, and it is stunning. The development of a vaccine that is safe and reliable is essential to saving lives. So I embrace an effort, and the National Urban League does, to ensure that our community, the Black community, the African American community, the community of African and Caribbean immigrants, are included in the clinical trials process in a significant way. Number two, that our community understands and hears from reputable Black medical professionals, as we just heard, about the true method of scientific research that goes into clinical trials in an effort to develop a sense of confidence that these processes will yield something that we are not fearful or trepidatious to take. That should be the goal here. And we want to see Black medical professionals as well trained, as well educated, as talented as any in the nation, in the front of this process, involved in this process, engaged in this process, because that will provide confidence to our community with respect to the ultimate development of a vaccine. Health equity and disparities in health includes the fact that historically scientific research has been redlined, and African Americans and people of African descent have been kept out. But however, if this moment of racial justice, if this moment of Black Lives Matter is to be real, then I call on the pharmaceutical community, I call on the National Institutes of Health, I call on the medical establishment to ensure that the mistakes and the exclusions of the past are not repeated in this process. Not repeated in this process. And I think that's our collective goal tonight. We begin this process of ensuring that our community knows, that our community understands, and that ultimately, if we are included and our medical professionals are included, we can have confidence. We need a vaccine that works. We have to save lives. We have to prevent this carnage. We're almost at 200,000 people, and some 40% of them are African American. It's not acceptable. We should be outraged. We cannot sleep. We cannot rest. We have to work and we have to fight. So I'm proud to be a part of this, and the National Urban League will stand with all in this effort and in this journey.
Dr. Frederick, do you mind speaking a little bit to what Mr. Morial was saying? Obviously, as president of an HBCU, that he really speaks to the heart of where you are, not only as a representative of Howard University, but also the medical community where so many people of color are practicing.
Yeah, Mr. Morial, first let me start by thanking you for your leadership on this. You've been a very vocal advocate for exactly what you just articulated again. We intend, as the historically Black medical schools, to be at the forefront of this fight. And yes, you're absolutely right. We are the pandemic within the pandemic. And what we must do in this moment, I think, of true reckoning in our country is make sure that these institutions that were stood up for the very purpose of assisting freed slaves with getting to that promised land, we must, in this moment, ensure that we fulfill that promise. And the way for us to fulfill that promise is to participate in the science and to participate in the clinical trials. And so we really appreciate it. And I do want to let our listeners know that you have a book out, The Gumbo Coalition. I received it this week. And I want to assure you that by the end of the weekend, I'll have it read. So thanks again for your leadership. And thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League. I want to go now to Dr. Peter Marks. He is the director of the FDA Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Dr. Marks, can we quickly begin by getting a better understanding of the FDA and how it plays a pivotal role in the vaccine approval process?
Yeah, so the FDA's job is to make sure that what comes in, that what Dr. Gibbons talked about, that clinical trial that gets done that hopefully has a cross-section of everybody in our country that's participating in it. We take those data, we look at them, we make sure that the trial was done correctly, we make sure that the data are accurate, and then we have our statisticians, the people who make sure that the numbers all look right. We go through, make sure that the trial says what it says, it actually means, which is that if it says it's an effective vaccine, it really is an effective vaccine. And very importantly for vaccines, we spend a lot of time making sure that they're safe, because these are going to be given to healthy people. We know that people are, it's a given. People are scared of vaccines. They're scared something is bad's going to happen to them. And so our job is to make sure that we do everything that we can to reassure people that when we say it's FDA approved, we've done our best to make sure that we understand the risks and we've absolutely minimized them.
Now, we've obviously added things like Operation Warp Speed, and I think when the public hears that, they think that we're rushing, that you're trying to get something over the line more quickly. But there has been unprecedented collaboration among scientists, among different pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
How can you assure and reassure the public that the process you have in place, despite the fact that it is on a fast track, will still be done in a safe manner that will give them faith that once you come to your conclusion, you would not have left out any steps?
Yeah, so one of the things about this Operation Warp Speed, which the name is a little bit unfortunate because it gives people the idea that everything's being rushed, but it's actually, the idea is that what's happening here is normally when one makes a vaccine, one does things one after another. One does very early development work in the lab, then one checks it in animals, then one goes into a few people, then one goes into a slightly larger group of people, and then one goes into the kinds of trials that are going on now, which are these big trials where you compare people who get the vaccine to people who get an inactive comparator, something that's like a sugar water or salt water. And those are usually done step after each other. And at the same time, nobody bothers making the vaccine till after they know if it works, which means it can take years for that process to happen. Instead, what's happened here is everything's been collapsed down somewhat. So it's not that anyone's skipping a step. It's that because look, human life is so valuable. If they're making the vaccine at risk at the same time they're studying the vaccine. So the idea is, they're going to make tens of millions of doses of the vaccine. It may be that it's like those T-shirts for the losing side, and I don't know where those go. I assume they end up somewhere, but they're printed, right? They go somewhere. Here, there's going to be vaccine. If the vaccine isn't shown to be safe, it's going to get thrown out. But it'll be there because if it is found to be safe, it'll be made and it can get into people's arms and it can start saving lives. And so that's the important thing here. And a very important piece of this that I don't want to miss out on saying is that one of our other jobs at FDA is to make sure that people in those trials who come through reflect all the people in our country. So we really need to make sure that the Black community needs to come out. The Latinx community needs to come out. We're in the Northwest. We're trying to get and make sure that we have the Native American population, the Native Alaskan population. We need everyone to come out because at FDA, it's not just good enough that it works in some people. This vaccine is going to have to work in everyone. And not only do we need to make sure it works in everyone, we want to understand, are there any special safety considerations in certain different populations too? So we need full participation here And that's really, really important.
And given that fact and the disproportionate impact this has had on African Americans, it would seem to reason then that as you look at the efficacy of each of the vaccines before approving, that you would want to see participation that also represents that disproportionate impact.
Yeah, we will not have done our job if we have a vaccine that does not have enough African Americans in there represented. We haven't done our job right. Because we need to make sure that we can say with a straight face that everyone who's going to get that vaccine is going to benefit from the vaccine in the way that we say they should, or we believe they should.
And my last question to you is, once the FDA approves a vaccine or multiple vaccines, what is the FDA's role going forward subsequent to that? Because I know the public sometimes thinks that once you approve it, you may walk away, and that certainly is not the fact.
Thank you for that. That's such a great question. We are responsible for the safety of medical products from cradle to grave, which means that when the first person gets it in a clinical study, we're responsible for their safety. But after the vaccine is approved, we do safety monitoring. We use large databases so we can look at millions of people who are getting the vaccine to make sure that there aren't uncommon adverse events that are showing up late. So especially for this vaccine, we'll be monitoring people, and we can monitor tens of millions of lives with these safety surveillance systems, and that makes sure that there's not even something that's we try to make sure that even things that are uncommon get picked up so that we can potentially do something about them, or at least inform people of the risk so that they know what to expect.
Dr. Marks, I do have a question. By the time the vaccine gets to the FDA, one of the things that a lot of people are wondering, why does it take so long to get to that point? Dr. Robert Redfield said today that he doesn't expect a vaccine to be ready until at least next summer. The president said that shortly after that Dr. Redfield was confused. And so there's a lot of differing pieces of information out there. Why does it take so long?
Well, the reason why this is complicated here is that I can't with a straight face tell you that I know when we're going to have a vaccine, but I can tell you what's going to happen. So there are these large trials in which tens of thousands of people, the large trials that are going on for each of the vaccines have about 30,000 people, equally divided roughly between those who get the active vaccine and those who get salt water. And then after they're vaccinated, they are followed over time. And then one has to look for, they're driven by the number of people who actually get COVID-19. And so one has to wait for people to get these cases. And when one gets to a certain number of cases, one breaks the code and sees, was the vaccine helpful in preventing COVID-19? So you just have to wait for those cases to occur. And so some of this is just kind of luck of the draw. Do the cases occur? When do they occur and when do they not occur? And so that's what we're dealing with here. So, the way I would say it, it's a little bit like probability. Is it possible that we'll have a vaccine that's safe and effective before the end of this year? It's possible. The likelihood will increase with each month as we come into the new year. So I don't know that it's going to necessarily be next spring. I hope it's going to be sooner than that, because everyone here was said something that it really spoke to me, which is, this is so terrible what it's doing to all our communities. I've lost colleagues, and it really has. We've seen it up close and personal, disproportionately affect the Black community, and it's just terrible.
Dr. Marks,
really people are away from us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marks, for your expertise.
Marks, I do want to thank you.
If you forgive me, I do have to take a break. I have to take a break, but I did want to thank Dr. Marks for his expertise in this particular regard, and we really appreciate all that you've had an opportunity to share with us. We want to remind people that this is a special two-night edition of the Daily Drum in partnership with the Black Coalition Against COVID-19. Once again, I'm Harold Fisher, joined by the president of Harvard University, Dr. Wayne Frederick, and we have a host of experts coming your way over the next 2 evenings to make it plain, providing African Americans the facts about COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials and what you need to know to make the best decisions for you and your loved ones. And we want to remind you that we will do a special Q&A with all of our experts participating after 8 o'clock tonight. But we're going to leave our WHUR audience right now, but the conversation continues online and Sirius XM as well as WHUR World. This is a special 2-part edition of the Daily Drum, Making It Plain, African Americans and the COVID-19 Vaccine. I'm Harold Fisher with the president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne Frederick. Now, this WHUR Town Hall special is presented in partnership with the Black Coalition Against COVID-19. Our next panel expert is Dr. Frida Lewis Hall. She's a prominent African-American women's health advocate and former chief medical officer of Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Hall, thank you for joining us. The push is on to get a safe and effective vaccine to the public. However, there is some skepticism about the timeline, and many African-Americans remain on the fence about whether or not they would actually take it. Can you talk to us about assuring the public that the medicines produced by pharmaceutical companies are indeed safe? What is that process like?
So you heard Dr. Gibbons and Dr. Marks both did a great job of describing the clinical trial process. You know, vaccines have been developed and manufactured for decades. So we have a process that's set that we know very well. It starts preclinically. We start before it ever touches a human, and we look carefully with experiments that'll help us understand if they could be toxic in some way. And then we also look at animal studies to help us understand a little bit about how the immune system might be enlivened in animals and how that might indicate what's going to happen in humans. And then you have the early phase trials. These are just a few healthy volunteers that are very closely monitored. This again helps us understand the safety and the potential efficacy. So is that our immune system getting going by exposure to this vaccine? Then we move to even larger trials. These trials will have, say, hundreds instead of just a few patients in them. And they will, again, be looking at patients that maybe are younger or older, have different ethnic backgrounds, some that are healthy, some that may have health risks. And then when you understand the safety and efficacy there, you move into these large trials that we've been talking about, tens of thousands of people. And some of those people are going to be exposed to the vaccine, and some people are going to be exposed to what's called a placebo. And then we'll be able to monitor whether or not it's safe and effective, but also protective. So we'll be able to see if those people who have received the vaccine are protected by the vaccine. I'm repeating that. I know they said it, but I'm repeating that because it's important to know that within a company, we have a process at each step of the way, teams of people who are expert and responsible for looking each step of the way at safety and at efficacy. I've managed teams before across the industry and a number of companies. These teams include those that are looking at safety vigilance, the ones that Dr. Marks was talking about, where even after a vaccine is approved, we are collecting, investigating, analyzing, and acting on data in these tens of thousands of patients. And then when it gets to millions of patients and more, we are staying on the job. We have committees that are looking consistently at ongoing research to ensure that if we see a side effect or an adverse effect, that we understand that as best we can and act on it, either by warning or in some cases by pulling a medicine or a vaccine back. And then last but not least, our experts in development are putting these protocols together, kind of understanding what do we need to ask, who needs to be involved in the trial, when should they be involved in trial, and when not. And again, they are monitoring this all along. That's just inside the company. Think about all the people involved outside of the company. You have investigators at the site. These are specialists in this area that are managing the trials. You have people who are working at the sites who are also experts in this. We have advisory committees. You heard Dr. Gibbons mention the data safety monitoring boards. These are independent boards that see this data every step of the way and have the ability to raise their hand to say whether or not they see something unsafe in it and bring it to our attention. We have bioethicists who work with us to help us understand who should be exposed. Is this too early or too late? To help us understand what we should do to be sure that everyone in the trial is as safe as we can possibly make it for them. And then academic centers like Howard University are there with their experts doing all the same steps I just talked about, looking at the safety, making sure that the trials are set up correctly and run properly. Independent boards at many universities, institutional review boards that look at what we plan to do and make sure that they're comfortable with that on behalf of the safety and benefit of the community. So we have kind of internal experts that are working all the time. And we have partners in the community and academic centers. And then last but not least, if that is not enough, we have regulatory agencies like the FDA or beyond. If you think about our global platform, there are regulators in Europe and Africa, et cetera. So we have people around the world who are looking at this along with us as we're setting the trials up, running the trials, collecting the data, analyzing it, and then finally approving this for use, and then still staying in partnership with us to ensure that it's safe once it gets from tens of thousands of people to millions of people.
Dr. Lewis Hall, I think your background is important for our audience to understand as well, because you are one of the most senior executives who is African-American at any one of these companies. And I think it's critical for you to probably describe a little bit of your path and some of the role. In other words, most of the people at the decision-making level that you have operated at don't look like you, don't look like us, but you've been on the inside and seen it. How can you assure the public that what is happening within these companies will be the right thing and they will be protected?
So, it's interesting. I started at Howard University, where I went to medical school, did my internship and my residency, and was there for a decade in the Department of Psychiatry, working in the hospital and the School of Medicine. When I went into the industry in 1994, and I've been in a number of companies in a number of roles, there was so much that I just did not know, even as a practicing physician, about how clinical trials were constructed and run, who was involved, how the decisions were made. And it was really reassuring to me when I went into the industry to see the seriousness with which each and every single step is taken. And I have to mention the people, because the level of commitment to safety, to changing and saving lives of people who work in the industry is really incredible. When I first started going, my colleagues were trying to warn me off, and people were thinking, you don't really want to do that. But once I got in and saw the scientific rigor, how serious the science was, and how committed the people were, how strong the processes were to ensure safety, every step of the way, it became a place I just couldn't leave. So I got in and I got hooked.
And my last question is it possible today to conduct a trial or an experiment as happened in Tuskegee with syphilis in African-American men?
People ask that all the time. This is a very different day and a very different time. There is so much interaction, participation. There's so many guidances as appropriate, and participation from the community that helps us figure out what trials to do, where to do them, how to do them, and that are a part of them all along the way. And I want to add, that is why it is so important for our community to become involved. We have got to, as African Americans, become front and center as investigators, as study coordinators at sites, as people who are working in the pharmaceutical industry. who are working in universities doing research as a part of this. We have to be all hands on deck and as participants in the clinical trials. This is going to be critical to our future.
Thank you very much. You're a distinguished alum and represent the epitome of the excellence that the Mecca aspires to. So thank you very much for joining us as well.
Dr. Lewis Hall, before I let you go, I did want to kind of piggyback on something that Dr. Frederick was talking about, because one of the overarching issues, and we can even look at some of the questions that are coming in from the people who are watching this from all over the country, the big 5-letter word, trust. That's a hard thing in this day and age of so much information going out. How do you get people to trust, considering the fact that we are dealing with, as they say, the novel coronavirus?
I trust my family to help me with much direction. They are my expert panel. And I was baffled. How can we as an industry be working so hard to save and change people's lives and be trusted so little? Mm-hmm. So I asked my Aunt Kitty, and she said, baby, first of all, y'all got to be trustworthy. And so there's really an opportunity for us to work together closely, for us to demonstrate that we are trustworthy, that we've instituted the rules, the regulations, the expertise. We have the commitment to the community. To do all of these things in partnership with the community. And I think when that begins to happen, we'll really increase the trust. The other thing that I think is really important, just as an example, is the recent pledge that was made by the 9 CEOs of the companies that are moving the vaccines forward. These are unprecedented times, and we realize that we have not created the kind of relationship, the close relationship and intimacy with our community that would allow African-American communities who have been so abused by the medical system to be trusting. And so this pledge, I think, is an exciting step to say, we're about the science, we're about healing, we're about helping and preventing. Partner with us so that we can show you.
Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Dr. Frederick, our next expert speaks from an area, of course, that you are intimately familiar with as a doctor and the president of a university that produces more Black doctors than any other institution. And Dr. Leon McDougall is the president of the National Medical Association. Dr. McDougall, talk to us about what physicians require if they are to advise their patients about getting vaccinated. This is a really important question, because those doctors are the boots on the ground.
Yes, very important question. So I'm the 121st president of the National Medical Association, representing the collective voice of over 45,000 African-American physicians and our patients. And we just convened our annual scientific assembly and convention. And as part of that, a resolution was introduced to the House of Delegates and passed overwhelmingly in support of convening a task force to speak to the safety, efficacy, and allocation of any COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics developed. So when we're speaking to this trust issue, being trusted messengers in the community, serving the Black community, that's what we do. And so we're convening. We have members of the CDC, ACIP, Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, Pediatric Society of Infectious Disease, Infectious Disease Society of America. We have people serving in roles where they have access to information concerning the vaccines. And we're going to have a charge of looking at that data, because as you are aware, you alluded to earlier about some of the public sentiment, and we had the FDA representative on, there's concern in the community when you have the emergency use authorization of hydroxychloroquine, which was later proven to be harmful, causing adverse cardiac events. This was followed by one day before the Republican National Convention, convalescent plasma use was approved by the FDA. And what happened? So then we had a panel of experts from NIH come in and say, well, hold on. We do not have sufficient evidence to say whether convalescent plasma is helpful or not. And there's some other questions that need to be answered in clinical trials. So it's like two strikes, right? And now we're hearing that from a political standpoint, we're going to come up with this wonderful solution right before November 3rd. And so there's some issues of concern there. So we as a National Medical Association want to be able to speak to that. So that's why we've convened this task force, because what was spoken to earlier really even goes beyond the pharmaceutical companies and broader as far as the national conversation is concerned. So we want to speak to that.
And so, Dr. McDougall, the 45,000 physicians that you represent, of which I am one of them, I have embedded within that group many experts who participate in clinical trials, who can help guide these patients in their communities. What types of questions should those patients be asking of those physicians?
So they should be asking about the informed consent process. You know, what is that? And what are the risks and benefits of participating in the clinical trial? That should be clearly spelled out. It shouldn't be in doctor language. Dr. Frederick, when we went to medical school, they said we learned 10,000 new words. So the patients volunteering for these clinical trials shouldn't have to learn 1,000 words just to be able to understand. Just like the title of this show, making it plain. That's what we do. That's what African American patients or physicians do when we talk with our patients, and that's been demonstrated in research. And there was the study done in Oakland, California last year, speaking to how when Black doctors especially speak to Black males about healthcare maintenance. So that Black doctor can, with that negotiation and that conversation that occurs, our patients are more likely to get that flu shot. They're more likely to get a colonoscopy, right? Because there's that relationship that we have, that understanding that we have. We're listening to our patients, and we are trying to do the best for them. And in this novel coronavirus era, we want to continue to do that and be that resource and work with Howard University, work with Morehouse, work with Meharry, work with Charles Drew. That's what we do.
And we appreciate that support. And I think to close, given the disproportionate impact that this has had on the Black community, do you want to see more African American patients participate in clinical trials safely? Do you think that that's a critical element to get us to a vaccine that works and that you can advocate for as a physician and as the president of the National Medical Association?
Yes, and we are advocating for that. I just writing a newsletter I sent into the Journal of the National Medical Association, asking our physicians to help enroll participants in the vaccine clinical trials, because that will be so important. So when these 30,000 persons are enrolled, we have a significant population of African Americans in the trial, so we can speak more concretely to and be able to look at the adverse effects and compare and see if certain populations are being more adversely affected by the proposed and vaccine. So yes, very, very important and highly supportive of our community participating in COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials.
Dr. McDougall, thank you very much for the work that you do and your representation. The National Medical Association continues to be a stalwart for the Black community, and certainly under your leadership, we're continuing to see that rise. So thank you very, very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. McDougall. Yeah. Now, this is a special two-part edition of the Daily Drum, Making It Plain, African Americans and the COVID-19 Vaccine. I'm Harold Fisher with the president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne Frederick. This WHUR Town Hall special is presented in partnership with the Black Coalition Against COVID-19. A reminder that we are not taking any phone calls this evening, but we do invite you to submit your questions on Facebook or YouTube. Join the conversation using the hashtag Vaccine Town Hall. And don't forget to stay with us for a special Q&A after 8 p.m. with all of our experts from this evening. Our final guest during this hour is Ambrose Lane. He's the founder of the Ward 7 Health Alliance Network. It is the largest community health advocacy group in the District of Columbia. Mr. Lane, you represent a portion of the DC community, which we know here as east of the river, the Anacostia River. Your community has been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. What are your constituents saying about a possible vaccine?
Well, we had our September meeting just this past Monday, and the discussion centered around vaccines, and it was very enlightening. We did have Dr. Reed Tuckson come on, who is the co-founder of the Black Coalition Against COVID, and we talked about this issue of vaccines. And you know, the word that permeated throughout the conversation was trust. You know, and several of your earlier guests have talked about this, have mentioned this. I think that Dr. Frida Lewis Hall was certainly on point when she talked about how there needs to be partnerships. And so, you know, one of the things that we learned during this conversation is that, you know, Howard University is out front, as well as the other three HBCU medical centers and medical colleges. And right now, they are participating with the federal government on the research activity to review the data that is coming out of the vaccine trials to ensure the consistency of what the science says. And that's very, very important. They are, in fact, being our behind the scenes trusted voices. But then you have to segue. So the question becomes, number one, how will these medical institutions share that important data with the African American community? Dr. McDougall talked about language, and language is very important. And if you learn 10,000 new words in medical school, and I didn't go to medical school, but as an English major, I still learned 10,000 new words. But nonetheless, how do you express that in a language that is understandable, that is digestible, and that the community understands and gets? And then on top of that, you know, how will these institutions, whether or not it's the FDA, whether or not it's NIH, whether or not it's the HBCUs, how will they partner with people from the community who, in terms of creating trusted voices or drum majors that can then lend credibility to the effort as we really all fall behind this important effort? And that becomes very important as well. So it's not just the step of the science, because the step of the science is important, but then transmitting that information from trusted voices, not only from the institutions that, you know, I also attended Howard University. So the trusted institutions, but then permeating down to trusted voices in the community, whether or not they attended college or went to Howard University, so that that information can be transmitted and really utilized in a trusted way by community residents who are going to participate and take place in these trials.
And Mr. Lane, what types of questions people asking out in the community as you move around? What are some of the concerns that are being expressed?
Well, you know, as I just mentioned, who are the trusted voices? Why should I trust these voices? I mean, the Black community has a very healthy disdain for a medical community that has not always walked down an ethical path. We mentioned Tuskegee earlier. There's a story of Henrietta Lacks. So there are numerous stories in which the medical community did not really engender trust in the Black community. Then there is, on top of that, the general mistrust of government. Donald Trump certainly does not make things any easier with his pronouncements that are not based on science and are not based on the facts. And so where does one get trusted information? The internet is replete with misinformation. Even on the COVID-19 vaccine, there are troll websites that are discouraging Black people from taking the vaccine once it's developed. And so we need to be able to depend on our institutions like Howard University, like Meharry, and these other institutions to be able to say that they are going to protect the interests of the Black community and the health of the Black community. So they're worried about the trust issue and who do we talk to, who do we trust?
Okay. In your constituency, you mentioned, you know, the history, but I'm sitting here, I'm reading some of these comments, and you described it as a, you know, kind of a healthy, you know, skepticism, and I appreciate you being diplomatic. These comments aren't diplomatic. These people are scared. And I think that's one of the serious pieces about this, because the coronavirus has already scared so many of us who have survived it, who have seen loved ones lost. And you know, this forum right now is so important because we need to make the move beyond lack of information, ignorance, and the political noise, so that, you know, not only our community but the entire American community can move past it once a vaccine is there. Does that mean that the experts need to take it first?
Not necessarily. That would certainly, I mean, you always have to be willing to take your own medicine. So, but what's more important in my view is the partnerships between the academic and scientific community and community leaders who can speak to these communities in terms of the science and the information. That's what's important. I mean, my 25-year-old healthy son, 26, I'm sorry, he just turned 26, healthy son said, "Dad, I'm not going to be the first one in line, but I'm not going to be the last one in line either." And so, you know, there is a skepticism, but there's also, you know, this discussion that this is critical and important. So he basically said he would take the vaccine. He just doesn't want to be the first one in line. So we've got to be able to convey something different to our community, that number one, it's safe, and that these institutions, particularly the HBCUs, can protect us, or the National Medical Association can protect us. And I think that those principles that were spoken of earlier, principles of research, are critical, and those are critical in also partnering with leaders that can also express those principles.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, Ms. Selena, earlier, Dr. Gibbons gave the analogy of the virus breaking into homes and then breaking into several homes in a neighborhood and having that devastation. And what we're looking for is a lock to put on those front doors. And it does make a difference who shows up and puts that lock.
Yes.
If you have a trusted locksmith that you've been working with for years and that person comes and puts a lock on, you're more likely to believe that that lock is going to be on there. And what we here at Howard University and the historically Black medical schools want to be clear about is that we want to examine how the locks are made. and we want to make sure that we participate in delivering the locks to our community.
Mr. Ambrose, before you respond, if I may, before you respond, because I do have to take a very short break as we leave our radio audience, and I want to invite all of our viewers to stay with us. The entire panel of experts will be here until 9 o'clock. They're going to take your questions online, and I also want to remind you that part 2 of this special edition of the Daily Drum will continue tomorrow night at 7. And both nights will be rebroadcast on our sister station, WHUT-TV, at a later date. I'm Harold Fisher. Join the conversation right now online. We are continuing to use the hashtag #VaccineTownHall. Now, thank you for staying with us for this online conversation, making it plain, a special 2-night town hall on African Americans and the COVID-19 vaccine. We are taking your questions for the next hour, but I do want to go back and allow Mr. Ambrose to finish his point. Please go right ahead.
Well, it's just that these partnerships become critical. Oftentimes, we find in institutions in the scientific community, they may have come out of the Black community, but then they serve their time as either doctors, physicians, and sometimes they do serve in communities that they come from. But we need a stronger relationship. We need a stronger bond and a stronger partnership. And so that becomes very critical moving forward and moving down the line, not just for the COVID-19 vaccine, but for other medical improvements that are coming down the line in the future. And so we cannot have a community that is stuck, a community that is stuck because it's based on something that happened in the past or based on a lack of trust. We have got to be the ones. And when I say we, I mean the HBCU community, trusted institutions like WHUR and WHUT, the Health Alliance Network, the Anacostia Coordinating Council. All of these become they are trusted sources, and they have to merge their efforts so that the science meets what the community's needs are.
Mr. Lane, if you can probably tell our audience what has been your experience with the Black Coalition Against COVID? Because I think as you talk about partnerships, that has been a unique partnership that I think has really emphasized and underscored exactly what you're advocating for. And in my humble opinion, has been probably one of the most effective types of partnerships that has occurred in recent times.
I have to wholeheartedly agree with you, Dr. Frederick. When Reed asked me to come on board, I didn't know where it was going, but the quality and the caliber of people that have been brought on board. I'm a co-founder as well, and on the steering committee, and I can safely say that this is one of the most exhilarating experiences that I've had in dealing with the medical community, but also community-minded people that really want to solve a problem that exists from no fault of our own, but is killing African Americans at disproportionate rates than they are anyone else. And so, it also brings to light the issue of health disparities and the inequities that exist in our community and have existed in our community for decades. And so it calls us to an action to be able to not just deal with the present, which is dealing with the COVID-19 virus, but also deal with the underlying inequities and those causes that put us in this condition in the first place. So my work generally centers around addressing chronic disease, but we all know that chronic disease is at the core of why African Americans are dying at higher rates. And so if we're dealing with these chronic diseases in a forthright way, putting resources behind them, getting communities involved, and solving some of their own chronic disease issues, then the future will look brighter and we won't be going through what we're going through right now.
And what are some of the activities that the Black Coalition Against COVID has been participating in, and who exactly is who are the partners in that coalition?
So we have labor, we have community, we have those that are in the business community, we have those that are doctors and physicians, we have those that are community organizers, we have people that for our former members of the Department of Health. It's such a great smorgasbord of talent that is there. And so we can come from different perspectives. We have been reaching out to the returning citizens community, to the labor community. We had a labor town hall. We have reached out to young people. We've had youth sessions as well, where we're getting information back from young people. It's just a wonderful thing to see happen in really such a relatively short period of time. And we came together in early April. And so this town hall is really a masterpiece that was put together, that is being broadcast through blackdoctor.org, for example, being broadcast through Howard University and WHUT. And that just shows the potential of what we can do. We haven't even segued yet into dealing with social determinants of health. We're focused on the coronavirus, but we have the ability not only to deal with what we are seeing right now in the District of Columbia, but what we can potentially do nationally as well.
And Harold, I want to thank you for your dedication and the work that you've been doing as well. And Mr. Lane, I want to thank you as well for your community activism. I'm going to turn it over to Harold to take us through the Q&A.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of questions. And before we even start that, I do want to briefly hear from Dr. Robert Philolove. Dr. Philolove is the Associate Dean for Community and Minority Affairs at the Mailman School of Public Health, Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Philolove, thank you so much for joining the conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Let me ask you.
My dad was a graduate of Howard's Medical School.
Excellent. Thank you so much for recognizing the Howard University family. Let me ask you, from your position, what do you think is probably the biggest challenge for the communities of color as we begin to move through this COVID-19 vaccine process?
I think more than anything else, the pandemic has shown how difficult it is for members of our community to get access to medical care, no matter where they are in the United States. I think those of us who've been around for a long time are really quite spooked by how, no matter where you looked, if there was a Black community that was hard hit by this pandemic, what did you see? Long lines to get tested, long lines to get test results, long lines to get treatment, and then huge medical bills. Once, if you survived the virus, you were home. So we're already behind when it comes to just how do we manage medical care. Now that we've got a pandemic that's going to require the distribution of a vaccine, what do we have in the way of distribution networks? What do we have in access to the hospitals and clinics that are going to be so much a part of what has to happen when a vaccine is distributed and people want to know, well, how am I doing? How's this all going? So as far as I can see, because we didn't do very well with the pandemic, once we have a vaccine that has to be rolled out, will we do any better? Will we have the mechanisms in place that will allow us to really search for the problems that exist in our community? Make sure that people are aware of the fact that the vaccine is available. Make sure that they have access to it, and then are happy with the fact that now that they've got it, they're not having any problems with side effects. I think all of those are the kinds of things that we're really concerned about. And we're not really clear whether or not we're prepared for the challenges that are ahead.
Mm-hmm. Excellent response. I appreciate that. Of course, that was Dr. Robert Philolove with Columbia University Medical Center. One of the other things that here we go. We have some questions here, and I'm going to try to throw these to some of our experts. So I hope that they are all ready, because we've got a lot here. Miss 13 is asking, are members of the community with sickle cell or trait being actively sought for the trials? Dr. Frederick, it's well known, that you have sickle cell anemia. And as we look at some of the trials and the participation, for example, of Howard University in this process, I'm sure that's a question that you've thought about. Can you share some thoughts about that?
Sure. Patients with sickle cell have a special risk because of the hemoglobinopathy that exists with sickle cell. The oxygen carrying capacity is already compromised. So getting COVID as a patient with sickle cell, like myself, portends an even larger risk. Recruiting patients with sickle cell for the trial, that represents one of the potential comorbidities. And having patients with sickle cell or patients with sickle cell trait, the more diverse the population is that gets exposed will do. And so on a personal note, if I am given the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, after being exposed to the informed consent and being assured of my safety, I will participate, because I think it is important for that information to be obtained so that others can be protected as well. This is a classic example of that, of us all having a responsibility for one another. And this is one way to exercise that responsibility.
Thank you, Dr. Frederick. Making that plain, you're not just talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. And I think that would go a long way to dealing with, the trust issue, particularly as you talked about, some of the core comorbid situations. So I appreciate your answer. Allison Matthews is asking, why does it matter, or give examples of studies where outcomes didn't serve African Americans well due to not having enough participation? Dr. Gibbons, can you address Allison's question, if that's possible?
It's really important to be inclusive. In fact, just to extend the previous question, is Dr. Frederick, as an expert in sickle cell disease, knows there are many individuals in the African American community who have sickle cell trait, but if we're going to do a study with 30,000 people, in order to get enough African Americans, let's say there are 3,000, you'd want to have enough who would have trait in order to figure out, is there a differential effect of those with trait and the vaccine or not? And so in order to understand something that is relatively uncommon amongst African Americans, you need enough African Americans in the trial with a trait like that is somewhat specific or more predisposed in African Americans. That's exactly why we need to be included in numbers, because there are certain characteristics of our patient profiles that will enable us to understand the full spectrum of risk and benefit in our population, in our communities. And it's certainly been true in other examples. There are certain drugs, cardiovascular drugs, for example, for heart failure, that have been shown to have even better benefit in African Americans relative to whites. And so we only know that when we're very inclusive and have large enough numbers to understand these interactions about particular subpopulations that either have greater benefit or perhaps less.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Gibbons. That's Dr. Gary Gibbons, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Let me go to Stephanie Mary. I hope I got that correct. Stephanie is asking, it would be really helpful if the description of a rigorous study was detailed in depth. Additionally, I would like to hear more about how the clinical trial process has been condensed. I believe this will help put clinical trial language in a more plain language form. Thank you in advance. Dr. Peter Marks, formerly with the FDA, do you have some thoughts about that, Dr. Marks?
Yeah, thanks very much. So it's a good question. The way things have been condensed here is really just in the way the trials have been laid out. The large randomized trial isn't being rushed in any way. It's just the way they're getting enough cases is by enrolling a lot of people. They could have enrolled a much smaller number of people in the trial, but it would have taken much longer to actually get an answer. By enrolling that many people, the hope is that they'll have enough cases to figure out whether the vaccine works. This particular type of trial is that the technical term for it is an event-driven trial, which means that there's a certain number of people who have to get COVID-19 in order to figure out whether the trials worked or not. So by having these really large numbers of people, they'll be able to get enough events to figure out whether there's a difference between those who got the vaccine and those who got the salt water. So that's the way that it's not really being condensed in terms of how you speed it up to try to cook the soup faster. It's basically just you're taking a lot more people and putting them in to the mix to try to get to those endpoints.
Thank you so much, Mr. Marks.
Howard,
please go right ahead, Dr. Frederick.
Dr. Marks, because I think you make an excellent point, and I think the questionnaire is really driving at something very important that you kind of described earlier. But I think that just to put a bow firmly on that, all of the safety measures, safety monitoring is still the same, regardless of the number of patients, the timeline involved. There's no difference in terms of the rigor for the safety things that are in place.
That is exactly correct. And people can rest assured that that's the case. I want to just say that it was unfortunate that there have been some things that have happened with FDA in the recent past, where people may have lost some confidence. But I can assure you that in the case of a vaccine here, we're taking this extremely seriously. I've made it very clear. People may not be aware of this, but I've made it very clear that nobody's coming and messing with the vaccine process, at least while I'm still around, because this is just too important for all of us.
We appreciate your advocacy. Thank you very much.
This is such another really great question. Manon Matchett is asking, are there any people of color who are participating in any of these trials that perhaps are journaling or documenting their experience? And are there stories that can be shared? Now, Dr. Frederick, I'm going to send that back to you, because I would imagine that on one hand, there are some people who write down everything, to talk about it.
In one of the trials, an African-American news reporter actually signed up and was the first person to receive the vaccine in that particular trial. I've actually seen a couple of follow-on stories. I didn't realize initially that she worked as a news anchor, a news reporter, and they've done a couple of follow-on stories with her. And I'm pretty sure that she's documenting it. And I think that there will be more people like that who will certainly do that as well and document that. And I like not just the question, but I would also take it a little further as potentially a suggestion that to increase confidence in what's taking place, it would be helpful, especially in our social media age, where we live out our life and experiences. I think it's almost an expectation for some of us to do that. I'm not into the voyeurism as much, so I have to admit that that's probably not something I would be prone to do. But I'm sure that there are those among us who will be comfortable, and that may give others some insight into what they're experiencing and really give people a more personal experience. So I appreciate that person's question.
Okay. Here's another one from Robert Simpson. How come vaccines in the past, and we need to put that question back up because I can't see it. Okay, let's go to Georgia. Coco Chick, it is imperative that there is transparency regarding the COVID-19 trials if we are to build trust for use of the vaccines. I want to go back to Ambrose Lane about the transparency piece, and I may even direct that question to someone else. But Ambrose, with the Ward 7 Health Alliance Network, talk to me, from your community perspective, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. People in the community, they want to make sure that they're hearing the truth.
Well, they want to know who they can trust, and then they also want to know what to trust. So transparency becomes a critical factor for communities to begin to make the bridge to trust the sources. And so If you don't have transparency, then you cannot build trust. And so whether or not it is coming from the institutions, whether or not it's coming from the medical doctors, from NMA, there has to be a level of transparency that is plain. All too often, we're also bombarded on TV with many types of drugs for almost every ailment. And if you listen closely to the commercials, some of them have serious side effects, including death. And I know that there is a move from some that are trying to eliminate the transparency of some of these drugs. So we cannot eliminate transparency when it comes to the COVID testing and the COVID vaccine. And we have to be able to express that fairly quickly and in plain language.
Howard, I think it would be good to bring Dr. Frida Lewis Hall in.
That's exactly who I was going to.
From her, I would love to hear from her lens what you can do about transparency, because obviously when you're collecting data and people are participating, it's almost impossible given some of the privacy rules in terms of reporting or telling people exactly what's going on. But there are some measures that can be taken based on what Mr. Lane has been asking for in terms of trying to build trust and partnership. And what are some of the things maybe even Pfizer is currently doing to assist with that?
So I can't speak directly to a specific company's trials, but in general, there are some things that have been done around transparency. I do want to underscore your earlier point, which is especially in a blinded trial, and that is where people don't know whether or not they've gotten the vaccine or know whether or not they've gotten a placebo. It's important to not unblind that by sharing who got what, where, and when, or by putting information or data out into the community, the scientific community or the general community, that might change the behaviors of people, depending on which one they think they got. So I think it's really important to not tell all early for the reason of actually needing the answer to the trial. But companies have started doing some things more generally, like making the data transparent back to participants in the clinical trial once the data has been unblinded. And that's a relatively new practice. Patients told us that participated, I did all of this, you didn't even tell me what happened. And so we're beginning to give greater transparency of data back to patients. The other is transparency on the active end. And I mentioned earlier things like people from the community becoming involved in the actual advising on what the clinical trial setup actually looks like. Helps us understand what we have to do at sites to make sure that patients can get there comfortably, carefully, and safely. The consent form, to have patients look at those consent forms and say, I don't understand, what are you talking about? That has to be fixed on a consent form. So all of these things are things that give you transparency during the conduct of the trial, and then getting the data out as soon as possible without interfering with the results of the trial. I think also creates a very different feel with the community.
And I'm glad
there's one other thing that's overlooked. Let me just say, there's one other thing that's often overlooked. Part of what the medical community and the universities and the FDA and NIH can do as well is to forthrightly debunk much of the misinformation that is out there. That will help kind of pave the road to a better system of transparency, because there are a lot of social media trolls, Facebook trolls that are giving out a lot of information that are specifically targeting African Americans. And I know Dr. Melissa Clark will be on tomorrow night, and she may talk about some of that. But the medical community has to help us understand what's false information as well.
I don't know if you could tell, but I was taking notes. And also, can I make a point on an earlier
comment? Go ahead, because I have another question specifically for you, but please go ahead.
But I wanted to make a point. Dr. Marks had talked earlier about kind of some of the unprecedented ways in which we were shrinking the size or the length of these trials. The other thing is collaborations. I have the honor to sit on the board of the board of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, and have been on there for a while. I like to say my hair was brown when I started. And we are actively involved in a project called ACTIVE, which is accelerating COVID-19 therapeutic interventions and vaccines. This is a public-private partnership that includes the National Institutes of Health, of course, the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, academic institutions, and a number of companies. This gives us a chance to do some things together that otherwise would have been done by each individual company and or the NIH, for example, and now we're doing them together and sharing the results, or working to create the protocols and sharing that information, working to figure out how to amp up getting patients to participate or people to participate in the trials. And that we're doing these things together also helps to speed the trial without sacrificing any of the important work that has to be done to ensure that people are safe and that the vaccines are effective.
Dr. Lewis Hall, go ahead, Dr. Frederick.
If I could just make one thing plain, the trial integrity that Dr. Lewis Hall just spoke to is critical. And my example for that is if we were having a trial as to who made the best burger, and it was blinded, you didn't see who made it, how it was made, and we just gave people the burgers to taste. If I came halfway through that process and said to someone, the burger on the left in the red wrap is the better burger, you may then influence what happens in terms of how people walk away feeling about that burger. So just to make it plain, the transparency and keeping the data unblinded, the two are not incongruent, or the two can still work hand in hand. But the reason you have to keep one a certain way is to make sure you keep the integrity so the results are not overly influenced by some kind of bias. It's not for the purpose of covering up anything wrong, but just to try to make it plain, since that's our title tonight. So you can go ahead with your question, Harold.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Frederick. So Dr. Lewis Hall, to the point about transparency, as you may remember, I believe it was last week that Moderna halted trials because of an anomaly with one of the people who was part of the trial process. He or she, I believe, had developed some sort of illness. Do you believe that is normal, or is it because we found out because there are so many eyes on this? I mean, literally, the eyes of the world, names like Moderna and Pfizer and others have become kitchen table names now. When people, unless you're taking drugs by these companies, that you just wouldn't talk about them.
So during the conduct of trials, I think it was Dr. Givens who mentioned the DSMBs that actually are looking at the data in an ongoing manner. We also have safety divisions. So we're collecting the data as they come, as it comes in. And if someone has a serious event, in the case, as in this case, then there's an investigation. Did they have another illness that we, didn't know about? Were they on another medication that could have caused this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to find out whether or not we believe they were related. And if they're related, and if we believe that there, is a mechanism, or we're concerned, absolutely, it is not unusual for us to either stop the arm that the trial is in, to not dose patients further until we understand more. So no, this is not wildly unusual because everybody's looking. These are the kinds of things that we do in the course of conducting a trial to make sure that if we find something in one person, or we see that it's come up in a few people, we don't just keep rolling along. We press pause if we believe that if they're related, to make sure that we really understand what's going on before we move along.
Thank you so much.
And that's a part of the everyday work that we do.
And thank you very much. And our viewers corrected me, and I appreciate that. AstraZeneca had halted the trial, not Moderna. I do want to go to our Q&A. There was a question up from Donald Shell, and we can bring that back up. And the question, and before I even ask that, we need to bring Dr. Gibbons and Dr. McDougall onto the screen so that we can have a broader participation in this conversation. Donald Shell is asking, how will the FDA vaccine safety verification process differ for fully approved COVID-19 vaccines versus the vaccines that are given an emergency use authorization, EUA? Is that the safety? Is the safety the same? Dr. Marks, that is a medical question. I believe that is coming from a medical person. If you could jump in and answer that, if you may.
So this has become and just like these, this is pretty funny. Just like these drug company names are becoming household kitchen table names, this EUA, or emergency use authorization, is also becoming a kitchen table name. So normally, when we approve a product that is fully approved, we have a standard that we use, which is called our effectiveness standard. And that is that the product has to be shown to be safe, and it has to be demonstrated to have substantial evidence of effectiveness that's demonstrated by adequate and well-controlled trials. For an emergency use authorization, it was developed after 9/11 to allow us to use products to help people who were sick, who might not have any other alternative. And so the standard there is simply that the product may be effective and that the potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks. Now, for a vaccine at FDA, we're actually, although we might use an emergency use authorization to allow us to deal with some of the administrative issues, not having to have someone take the months, because it actually takes a while to put together the tens of thousands of pages that normally go into these submissions. And then it takes us at FDA, even working at breakneck speed, a few months to actually review it all. In order to avoid delaying the process, which could cost thousands of lives, we would use an emergency use authorization and yet still pretty much use the same standard that we would have used for a normal type of approval. So in the case of vaccines, which are used for healthy people, mostly, some with comorbidities, but will go to a lot of healthy people, our tolerance for risk is not the same. And so we will ensure that the standard that's used will be very similar to the one that would be if it were a normally approved product in terms of efficacy.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Peter Marks, thank you so much. We also wanted to thank Dr. Wayne Frederick, president of Howard University, for participating in this program. He had to bow out during this last 30 minutes or so, but we are still entertaining and your questions for our viewers. And so please continue to share your questions with us, and I will definitely put them to the panel. Do we have another question that we can put up? Let's go. Manon Matchett is asking, so who is the authority that authenticates the legitimacy of any vaccine that is finally approved, especially for populations of color? Dr. Marks, I guess that's another question for you. And your microphone is off, Dr. Marks. Please check your...
Sorry about that.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to hear background noise there. So it's a good question. The FDA, there'll be a few things that will happen. FDA will review all of the data. We actually, in some cases, will send inspectors to look at the data. We'll look at the facilities where the product is being made. We'll look at the distribution of who's been in the trials, and we actually will potentially do analyses breaking the trial down by the different types of people who have been in the trial to understand that there's been adequate mix of people enrolled. And when we put our approval, be that an approval like that we give a license so that something can be marketed, or if we say that we can issue an emergency use authorization, we're essentially putting our seal of approval on that. And our folks who are career scientists, these are not political people. These are people that come to work every day solely because they really care about making sure these products are safe and effective. Those scientists and physicians will look this over and make sure that they feel comfortable enough that it's good enough for their families and it's good enough to approve. Ultimately, after we're done with it, it will also then probably go to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice. That's a committee of the Centers for Disease Control, and they'll talk about whether they'll look at the data, and they'll also make a recommendation about who should best receive that vaccine. So it's not just FDA; it's also the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will have some, but I think getting to that question, just give me 1 minute for latitude here. What really is important is that we're going to do this in a transparent way. There will be a public advisory committee meeting. The public advisory committee is, the people on that are mostly academic physicians who they've been vetted, they don't have conflicts of interest. They will discuss the data that's been submitted by the manufacturers, and that'll happen in a public setting where people can watch. And so hopefully people will see that by having it go through that open process, they'll feel more confident that nobody's trying to pull a fast one here.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Peter Marks, thank you so much. This next question is for you, Dr. Gibbons. Dr. Allison Matthews is asking, they have been working on coronaviruses for the past 10 years. They have also been working on the process of developing vaccines using mRNA. Dr. Matthews, you are hurting me right now with these medical terms. I did not go to med school. So we're going to have, first of all, Dr. Gibson explain what is mRNA? And she goes on to say this science is not new. Can you comment on that, please?
So try to be quick here. That when in your body, the genetic code, all the information to make all the proteins in your body is in your genetic code, your DNA. The machinery that translates that genetic code and tells a cell to make a protein, including the hair on your head, is also encoded in the RNA. And so one way we talked about making a vaccine is it can make a protein that's part of the virus to then activate the immune system to rev it up so that when the virus comes, it will attack that protein. Well, the way to make a vaccine now is to actually just use the messenger RNA. That's a great molecular machine for making a protein, and basically tells, once it sticks in your muscle, it'll make that protein and then activate the immune system. And so by now knowing that code, and we knew this code about SARS-CoV-2 within weeks back in December and January, and that's what also accelerated that process. It's also a quicker way to make a vaccine in some ways. It still is new in terms of getting into a trial of this scale, but it is a promising technology. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Grapevine Health. It says, can Dr. Gary revisit the issue of why race matters in trials? If race is a social construct and not biological, why would we think the vaccine will perform differently in Black people? Before I give you that question, Dr. Gibbons, I would like to hear what Dr. Phililove has to say from Columbia University. Dr. Phililove?
Well, I think more than anything else, what we're concerned with are exposures. You're absolutely right. Just in terms of the DNA in the human race, there is no specific genetic signature that allows us to tell a Black person from a white person, et cetera. But Black people live in very different settings and circumstances often than do others. And we're not sure how much of our health is a function of what happens when we're in those settings. What's the nature of the exposures that we have as a result of where we live? And how much might that have an impact on whether or not, if you're exposed to COVID-19, whether or not you'll get an active infection? So we're not just testing people based on their biology, we're also testing them based on the social realities that are a part of their lives. And I don't think there's anybody in this audience who doesn't agree with the notion that where we live and how we live does differ rather markedly from what you're going to see in mainstream communities. So we're covering all our bases by making sure that if there are social factors that explain why COVID-19 is so prominent and so problematic in our communities, that we will have covered that by having enough representation in the trials to make us clear that, yeah, we think we've covered the Black experience well enough so that when we say this vaccine will work for our folk, it really will.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That question was directed specifically to you, Dr. Gary Gibbons. Can you give me a brief response to that?
Yeah, just Dr. Fuller covered it very well. And I would just add, in addition to that social context and exposure, is that also influences our biology. No one would be surprised that your lived experience, what you're exposed to, might determine what you're now allergic to, how your immune system responds to, again, a foreign protein. But that may be different for different people with different exposures. The same thing is true with regard to other kinds of biological responses to exposure. So it actually goes both ways with social and biology.
Thank you so much. I believe we have another question. This is from Inya. And this is such a great question. I was actually looking at this question as it was scrolling up. What efforts are being made to recruit academics of color to serve on the various advisory boards and committees that have been mentioned? Dr. Leon McDougall with the National Medical Association, this is in your wheelhouse, sir.
Yes, so great question. On our task force, I know of 3 people who are on these national advisory committees, and in meetings with leadership from Dr. Francis Collins to Dr. Robert Redfield, questions were specifically asked, especially of Dr. Redfield, in regards to, in his role as Centers for Disease Control and Prevention director, what efforts had he made to help ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion at CDC. So I can't speak to the specifics, but I do know, for example, NIH Dr. Hannah Valentine was brought in to help with diversity, equity, and inclusion across NIH. I do know that people are aware that this is a concern, especially when we speak to that trust issue. So very good question.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Harold, could I just
please do.
As it was mentioned earlier by Dr. Lewis, that there's active program. This is a public-private partnership of accelerating COVID therapeutics and interventions and vaccines. I actually serve on that executive committee with the NIH director, Francis Collins, my colleague, Tony Fauci, and members of the FDA and leadership of major pharma. So we're in the room having these dialogues on a frequent basis. And that's also inclusive of the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams. So I think one of the differences about this and, say, Tuskegee 40 years ago is literally this show, where there are people of color in positions of authority and power and capability who are at the table all throughout this process as well. Thank you.
Dr. Gibbons, I want to continue with you on another critical question. During the course of this conversation, we've heard this term informed consent, and I wanted to have some clarity about what it is and why it's important.
Well, as part of a participation in the clinical trial, That's actually one of the greatest acts of social beneficence and generosity, and why we're so appreciative of research participants. There may be benefit, but the greatest benefit really in a case like this is what you're doing for your neighbors, what you're doing for your family members, based on what we learned from this trial that goes beyond yourself. And it's important that as you participate or decide to participate, that you understand very clearly what are the risks and the benefits. And that needs to be explained, as your title is, speaking plainly, making it plain, in language that you can understand. And a lot of work is done to make sure that it's in multiple languages and literally is at maybe a 5th, 6th grade reading level, just to be sure everybody understands very clearly what they're getting into. And it's actually a living process. You can withdraw from a study at any time, and you can ask questions, and you should. So that's critically important to the process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Marva Overton is asking, there are likely to be different vaccines by different manufacturers. How will the public know the difference, and if one is better than the other for them? Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, I believe that one is for you.
Actually, I thought you were going to ask Dr. Barks about that one.
No, I'm going to let you have that one.
Yeah. So, first of all, the vaccines, as they're demonstrated to be safe and effective, will have information in them. We mentioned that as you get larger numbers of patients participating, we'll understand a little bit better whether or not they're effective 50% of the time or 60% of the time, or whatever the percentages are. And you'll understand some of that information. The other thing that we'll find out during the conduct of the trials is what the adverse events are, or the adverse or side effects might be. And we'll understand those. If you look at a label now, it'll tell you what some of the side effects are and how often they occur. And we talked about different populations, because in addition, we talk a lot about benefits and how that might be different from one group to the other, but side effects may be different from one group to the other as well. So we'll have that kind of information, and we'll then be able to compare, even though they're not compared directly. So you can't, it's not like, number to number comparison, but you'll understand a little bit more who this might be effective in, who might be at risk for adverse events, et cetera. And that information is shared when there's an approval, in the same way that it would be if you look at, that long list of side effects and stuff like that on the label that you get when you take your medicines. So you'll understand a little bit more about it.
I'm not sure if this is the best analogy, but could we get to a point where you've got a Zyrtec and a Claritin, both of them deal with allergies, but one works better on somebody? Is that a possibility when it comes to something like this, or does everybody get the red pill? Dr. Marks?
Yeah, this is actually a great reason for having everyone participate in these trials, so we have diverse populations, because it's not inconceivable that, I'm not saying it's going to happen this way, but it may be that if we have 5 or 6 vaccines, there may be some vaccines that work better in some genetic backgrounds, in other words, some of your heritage, than others. And so that would be an important thing to figure out, because for COVID, every percent closer to 100% protection we get is a big deal. So that may be another distinguishing thing here. So that's yet another reason to come out and participate in trials, because with multiple vaccines out here, the vaccines, there are going to be some that are going to be based, like Dr. Gibbons based on this mRNA platform. Some will be based on DNA, proteins, viruses, various viruses, killed viruses, live viruses. And so because they tickle the immune system in a different way, and because all of us are a little bit different based on our heritage from the past, we may we may find that there are differences, and some of these vaccines may work better for some than others. So that's an important piece that we'll try to tease out at FDA as we move forward.
Critical point there. Thank you so much. Jennifer Singh is asking, since the most at-risk community of contracting and dying from COVID-19 are elderly people, will older communities be targeted for the vaccine first? Dr. McDougall, do you have thoughts about that?
That's another good question. And algorithms or plans are being developed in regards to that, answering that very question. We had an opportunity to participate in a panel last week, a representative from the National Medical Association. So prioritizing higher risk groups. Now, that's where that trust comes into play and has been an issue, because you go from African American community being less likely to answer questions correctly or satisfactorily, to be then go to the diagnostic testing aspect for COVID-19. You have data initially not even demonstrating race and ethnicity characteristics, and taking quite a while for us to even have data showing that African American, Latinx, and American Indian populations are being impacted more. So on this front end, there's this relative lack of attention to details concerning diverse communities. And now, well, you're at the front of the line. So I think that's where this discussion is really important, and speaking to these questions to help drive clarity in the reasoning behind decisions that are made as it pertains to COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics.
Thank you for that. Nicholas St. Fleur is asking, should students at HBCUs be encouraged by their universities to participate in the vaccine trials? If so, shouldn't students at majority white institutions also be encouraged to participate? Dr. Fullerlove, I'm going to let you handle that, although I would imagine you better talk to the parents first.
Well, more than anything else, in the past, a number of things about America's higher education students have made them the people that we most have access to and want to be a part of trials like this. We know that if we ask them to give informed consent, that presumably they have the intelligence to really know whether or not the consent that they're giving is free consent. I think that we want to make sure that we represent all of the age groups that are likely to be impacted by this pandemic. And one would assume that when we're looking at folk of college age, we want a sample of both students from HBCUs as well as from institutions like Columbia University. But I want to be clear, I'm not a part of the group that's actually running the trials, but I am someone who talks to students on an almost daily basis about what we should be doing to make sure that our voices are heard, and to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to support the communities that have been hard hit by this pandemic. If that means if you're offered an opportunity to participate in the trial, then hopefully you would do that. And I think that's a message that a lot of people in higher education are going to be passing to their students uniformly.
Thank you so much for your thoughts about that. Jennifer Byrne is asking, what happens if I receive a placebo vaccine in the study and later a vaccine is approved? Do I not get protection against COVID-19 for the remainder of the study? Dr. Marks, do you have thoughts about that?
Let me get off mute here. Yeah, no, that's a great question. What will happen very likely is after the trial is declared a success, after having enough events, it would be the standard practice for this. I can't promise this is what's going to happen, but the very likely thing that will happen is that everyone who received placebo will be offered the active vaccination. That's what you get for having offered to participate at the beginning. You get at the end, when they figure out that it seems to be working, the opportunity to come back. It creates a little bit of a problem for us because we don't always get the amount of placebo-controlled data that we might like, but we can't mess with this here. Once they declare efficacy, it's very likely that everyone will be offered the active vaccine who enrolled in the trial and who got placebo.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. We have about 5 minutes left. I want to try to get another question. And Dr. Allison Matthews, back again. She's saying if they're over 18, they can make their own decisions about participating. No doubt there, Dr. Matthews. Thank you for that more simplistic question for those of us who did not go to medical school. I do have one other question, and this is for Ambrose Lane. Again, this is one of those boots on the ground questions. Who do you think, once a vaccine is developed, who do you think should get it first? We have communities of color disproportionately impacted, but how do you balance that with those who say first responders, doctors, and other medical personnel should also get it first? Your thoughts on that, Mr. Lane?
No, there's no question that first responders should get it, but I also think that seniors and elders and those with chronic disease should get it. And there was one question that wasn't answered, and that was the effects on children. We've seen with COVID-19 that a syndrome does manifest in some children, and whether or not there are any plans for children to be included in the vaccine trials, and I put that to the panel because that syndrome, and there are children that have died from the syndrome, and so we still don't have any answers about this. But it does beg the question of whether or not children should get vaccinated as well, or at least participate in the trials.
That's a really interesting question. A response. Thank you. Aurora Sullivan. Some people do not have access to an African-American physician and or do not have the possibility to build trust with African-American professionals. How do we reach these communities and build trust with them? Dr. McDougall, that's definitely a question for you.
So I would recommend that you access the NMA.net website. We have on our website a number of platforms for educating the community, ranging from NMA talks to other available resources, including a most recent collaboration with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and actually have a session entitled "What the Black Community Needs to Know About COVID-19 Vaccines." And we also speak to some of those conspiracy theories and also speak to some of the alternative therapies that have been proposed by members of our community, such as alpha interferon. So, and yes, that would be my recommendation. Also, I'll add to that. So we're working with the Rainbow Push Coalition, and on their website, we have interviews with Dr. Francis, Dr. Robert Redfield, upcoming. I'm being involved with a conversation with General Perna, who oversees Operation Warp Speed, and I'll be asking questions such as, with the rollout of the vaccine clinical trials and the vaccines once approved, will the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program come into play, and when does that become available?
Okay, I'm out of time. But I do want to thank all of you for participating in this program. It has been quite informative, and some would say we've only scratched the surface, and we are going to talk about, of course, more of this on tomorrow. We want to remind you to join us tomorrow at 7 as we continue Making It Plain, our 2-day town hall on African Americans and the COVID-19 vaccine. And I want to thank Howard University President Dr. Wayne Frederick, the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, Howard University, Morehouse School of Medicine, Meharry Medical College, Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, the National Medical Association Cobb Institute, and the National Urban League. And certainly you can learn more about clinical trials and vaccine processes to just go to Black Coalition Against COVID.org. I'm Harold Fisher. Again, thank you for watching. We will see you tomorrow. Good night.